So, I want to talk about Sega. There's a lot, and I know you were talking earlier that you had some things you want to mention, but one thing in particular for me that stands out that I read this week, and it's confirmed. There's pictures of it. I don't know if there's actual footage, but even Sega itself showed it off. And that is a brand new arcade cabinet of Daytona, USA.
Yep. That's crazy. Like when you told me, I was like, seriously?
Yeah, I'm excited
crazy.
for it, to be honest. Now, currently where I live, we don't have any arcades, and that
Same
sucks
here.
ass. But
That's why it surprises me, I think, because arcade.
well, here's the thing, like, there are a lot of cities that have Dave and Buster's, and those are your arcades now, essentially. But my thinking is, if they sell enough of them, they're probably going to end up bringing it to the consoles as well, and that would be awesome.
Yeah, actually, I would like to see them bundle everything from Daytona 1, 2, and 3. 2 never saw a home release, so...
Yeah, that would be pretty cool.
That would be cool. Now, since that's a superb launching point, it's kind of funny, you viewers don't know this, but I actually sent Mark a text earlier this week saying, hey man, I want to talk about Sega on the podcast. I didn't even say why. And he's like, well yeah, Daytona 3 is coming. And I'm like, what? So I wanted to talk about them before I even knew that was coming, so it kind of worked out well. So, you were a Genesis kid, weren't you?
I definitely was.
I was not. I was Nintendo.
Blast processing for the win.
Blast processing, sure, right. And blast processing and fart sound music. Yeah.
Hey,
So
at least we got some good laughs.
I was a Nintendo guy, clearly. I'm sure everybody watching this that was alive during the 16-bit wars already figured this out. However, my infatuation with Sega started, ironically enough, with the Saturn. Because by that era, nobody really gave a crap.
And you know what? It's kind of funny. Here we are, 16-bit era. I was with Sega, you were with Nintendo. Then with the 32-bit / 64-bit era, I was with Nintendo and you were with Sega.
I kind of was. That's when I actually started going with every platform. But the Saturn was the first to really wow me. And ironically, the PlayStation was the last. But as generation as a whole, and we're not going to get into this now, but my favorite console that generation was easily the PlayStation. But probably followed by the Saturn and then the N64. N64 is my least favorite Nintendo console. I know everybody's going to hate on me in the comments. Go ahead, but it's my opinion, so...
Yeah, my friend had a Sega Saturn, and whenever we'd go to his place, which, it was about an hour and a half away, we'd go there for weekends. We'd be playing that Saturn all the time. I'd bring my 64, he'd hook that up in his bedroom, and he'd be playing all the games we had for that. We'd be in the living room playing his Saturn. It was kind of funny, like we'd supposed to hang out, but nope.
Well, see, it's interesting for me because when I first discovered the Saturn and saw it, I still remember the first game I ever saw. I didn't even know it was out. Like most people, I would eventually learn, nobody knew it was out until it was. I was in a Toys R Us, and I saw a kiosk running Panzer Dragoon.
Yep.
And I could not believe what I was seeing or hearing or anything. Graphics,
They need
sound,
to bring out another one of those, let me tell you what.
4 was not enough. And so that really caught my eye. And then my mom, because I was only like, I want to say 13 or 14 at the time. I don't remember how old I would have been in 95. So anyway, math is hard, guys. So anyway, my mom, like, we were doing something in town, and she stopped at one of her friend's house. Well, her friend had a son who was a couple years older than me, and he had just bought a Saturn. And and this was before Sega gave away 3 full games with the system. But he had bought Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter 2, and Sega Rally.
Oh man!
So he's like, man, you gotta check this out. And now the cool thing for me at the time was I was just getting into arcades. So when I walked into his room and he was sitting there playing Virtua Fighter 2, I was like, this is exactly like the arcade game. Now I know better. But at the time, it was like, wow, how the hell is this possible? And it just blew my mind. And I've been kind of on board with Sega
I remember going to the arcade and playing a game and going home and like, ooh, we need to rent that for the Genesis. And then, like, actually, good one here. We were at my friend's playing Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 on the Saturn. And I remember back then, it just looked so incredible.
It's arcade perfect, essentially, yeah.
Yeah, I loved it big time. And then, as soon as we went home, I told my mom, hey, we gotta go rent this game because I need to play it. Well, we ended up buying it. And, oh my God, I was like, what the hell? This looks like ass.
Did you have the 6-button controller?
Yes.
You did, good.
But the thing is, the graphics just look poopy. And that was when I knew that the Saturn was definitely more powerful and everything, you know. And then we got the N64, and I got Ultimate Mortal Kombat or was it Mortal Kombat Trilogy. And that game, in my opinion, looked way better. And then my friend and I were kind of arguing a lot which one was better.
To me, the sound in that game was just atrocious. It was just so bad. If you go and play like the PS1 version of Trilogy, a million times better sound. But it has loading. Yeah. And so that means Shang Tsung also doesn't work right because his morphing ability is severely gimped on the old CD-ROM systems because it had to load each morph. So if you tried to play as Shang Tsung, you couldn't really morph quickly without the other player figuring out that you were morphing because everything would stop for a second while it loaded the new character.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
So anyway, we're not talking about Mortal Kombat, we're talking about Sega. Now, Sega got off to a rough start with its early days. I'm going to skip the SG-1000 because I don't know really anything about it. But the Master System, rough.
Well, that was because of Nintendo's little monopoly on the developers.
Yeah,
so
and
Sega decided they were going to make their own games, and
but you got to remember the mindset too at the time. Like everything was Nintendo, even when it wasn't at the time.
Although, this is an interesting tidbit about the Master System. I don't know if it was like random, but I know that each system came out, they had built-in games.
Yeah.
And the one, like a friend of mine from when we were kids had a Master System, and I remember playing this maze game that he had. You know, like it was kind of neat. He's like, "Don't put a cartridge in. There's a game already in there." And we would play this maze game, and like it would fill the whole TV, and it was really small, and like you had to get from here to down there, and we'd spend a couple hours trying to beat that little mini game.
I would say, like, back then I didn't know about the Master System. I seriously didn't even know it was a thing. I knew of a Sega, so I probably saw it in passing, but just didn't realize that there was a Master System and a Genesis. It's funny too because if you go back and compare it to the NES, it has a reasonable tech.
It's better looking.
Yeah, it did a lot of things that the NES didn't really do. It just didn't have the support, I suppose, for obvious reasons.
No, so, everyone was forced to use Nintendo.
Right. So anyway, it's fun to go back if you guys want to go and check it out. I suggest doing so. Now, the Genesis is really where they hit their stride. They put on the heat with Nintendo a lot. They had some hardware that was actually better in some ways, not as good in others. I know the processor was slightly faster than the Super Nintendo's, but the Super Nintendo could handle way more colors on screen than the Genesis could. Plus, the Super Nintendo had that awesome Sony-made sound chip, which is ironic. And that's kind of where I want to start this little story. Now that we've shared our backgrounds with Sega. Because when I was in college, I did at least 2 different reports on Sega. I don't know how I got away with it, but I did. I worked it into my class topics, and I ended up with good grades. And I learned a whole lot about Sega at the time. And it's really interesting every single time I think about it. Because they could have been on top so many times, but somebody in the cog that is Sega just didn't see the light. So this would start with Sony. They had a good relationship with Sony originally when they were developing the Sega CD. And then when they found out that Sony was making a CD with Nintendo, which is a whole nother story for another day, they weren't too happy about that. So they got a different partner for the Sega CD stuff and all that. Now, the interesting thing here is that when they started development of the Saturn, which I don't remember the code name at the time, but the interesting thing is that they were actually presented with the hardware that would become the PlayStation in terms of CPU and graphics. And they declined because they didn't think that the industry or the consumers were ready for 3D quite yet. So instead they went with a hardware variant that was more 2D oriented, and in fact a 2D powerhouse, which did become the actual Saturn. That was one big misstep. They could have had the PlayStation, essentially, but they didn't. They declined. And I believe that was actually Sega Japan, because they didn't think 3D was the future yet. I don't know how the hell you think that. They thought CD was the future, but they didn't think 3D was.
Well, maybe they just didn't think that the possibilities that the machine could do were good enough.
Yeah.
But, you got to start somewhere.
Now, to be fair, the Saturn had infamously complex hardware. Really,
because
really
of their
complex.
2D.
Yeah, and if you were to really max that out, you could probably get some crazy shit out of it, but the sad thing is that it was so complex and nobody wanted to make games for it, and therefore the Saturn died way too soon. So we never got to see what the Saturn could actually do from a tech standpoint.
Well, I think actually we kind of did, more recently with the Shenmue Saturn, leaked footage.
That's probably the closest you could get.
Yeah.
Which
that
is impressive,
in itself looked pretty damn good, but also look how much money was spent.
Yeah, that game was super expensive. Now, to rewind just a touch here, we all know that 32X and Sega CD were mostly big missteps for Sega. Sega CD lesser, but
I had a 32X.
The 32X was the big misstep for them. So there's a funny story there. Because initially, Sega Japan thought, hey, why replace the Genesis when we can just upgrade it and give consumers 32-bit games on the same system? And you're going to pull it out right now, aren't you? Oh, no, man.
There.
Okay, well,
yes.
that was a nice system with poor battery life, but
yeah,
cool anyway.
6 AA's, 2.5 hours.
So anyway, Sega Japan thought that just upgrading the system with attachments like the CD and 32X would be the better way to go, rather than trying to convince millions of people to buy a new system. Sega of America, they did not like the idea of releasing a 32X at all, and because it was only a year coming, they wanted it released a year before the Saturn. The president at Sega of America at the time, Tom Kalinske, really pushed them, saying like it's a bad idea, don't do it, it'll confuse the consumer, and it's just, when we have the Saturn coming out, you know, it's right there, why would somebody want the 32X? Well, they forced it. Japan forced it and said to release it, and they did. 6 months later, the Saturn was out. Such a huge, colossal failure right there.
Now, I actually opened up the 32X when I had it. I wanted to see what was inside. And it actually has 2 Hitachi SH2 processors. Yep. And at the time, I was like, oh my God, thing's running dual CPUs. That's amazing. And then from what I understand, didn't the Saturn have an SH2 in there?
Yes.
Or 2 of them? I mean, I know it had multiple chips.
I think it had 2. It had a total of like 7 processors or 8 processors or some shit. They're all for different things, but it's like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So we have that whole mess there, and it is always, this is a trend you'll always notice with Sega, is it was always a fight between Japan and America, and it's like, I don't know, I feel like Japan kind of had their heads up their asses for a long time.
You know what it reminds me of is a franchise. Like, if you're a franchisee, you're running your business, but you're running it how the franchise corporation tells you.
Yeah.
Even if you have better ideas than them. So Sega of America was the franchisee. And they had their ideas, they wanted to do certain things, and Sega of Japan, being the franchise corporation, said, no, we have the rules and you're going to follow them.
And you know what's funny about that analogy? Is that Sega was founded as an American company.
Yeah.
Service
wasn't
games.
It out of like Hawaii or something?
Yeah, service games, and they basically provided arcades and stuff for military. And somehow Japan just took over. So we got that misstep. Saturn could have been PlayStation. Well, before the Saturn actually came to be what it was, another company, Silicon Graphics, approached Sega with an offer. They had this fancy new 3D technology that they thought Sega would really like. Well, you can all guess what system that ended up going into. The N64. It's just like sigh after sigh. Like, you didn't see this? Like, seriously? Alright, so then we had the Sega Dreamcast, which is obviously, as many people know, the last system Sega made. And they had a lot of problems there, too.
Actually, there's a lot of stuff, and a lot of people may not, I mean, they may be too young, but 3DFX, they had a bid on doing the graphics for the Saturn, or for the Dreamcast. Mm-hmm. And that could have been pretty interesting if they would have got in there. That could have, 3DFX may actually still be around today if that were the case. You know, I remember their Glide API was much superior at the time. But when they kind of fizzled out, you know, Microsoft had to step up with DirectX, and you know, that's what we have today. Everyone uses DirectX.
Yeah, and I believe ATI actually bought them out.
No, NVIDIA bought out 3DFX.
Did NVIDIA buy them?
Yep. And then shortly after they implemented, now it's their own version, but they utilized the trademark of SLI. But that's why we get cards.
Yeah, because there were some 3DFX cards that could actually run in dual mode, if I remember right.
Oh yeah, Voodoo 2s were the first ones to do it, and essentially all the cards after that. However, it's kind of weird. They had the VSA 100 chip, which I believe is what would have been what went into the Dreamcast, and God, that would have been interesting. See, that chip was designed from the beginning to be modular, and they went Voodoo 1, 2, 3, and then came out with Voodoo 5, and then kind of a little bit afterwards put out the Voodoo 4. But the 4 and 5 are essentially the same GPU. It was just how many of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the Voodoo 5 had 2 of those chips, and then in prototype form, it never released, was the Voodoo 5 6000, which had 4 of those chips plus 32 gigs of RAM, which at the time, 32 gigs was huge.
Yeah.
I think the Voodoo 5 5000, which was their dual chip card, I want to say it had 16 megabytes of video memory, which at the time was, standard, I guess.
Yeah.
I could be wrong on those numbers too. It's been a while.
So the interesting tidbit I wanted to mention here is that Microsoft had approached Sega about collaborating on a console, and Sega declined because of Japan pride, I suppose. I don't know.
Could be.
I actually don't know why. But they did work out a deal to get Microsoft's Windows CE onto the Dreamcast to help developers, essentially.
And actually, I want to bring this up too because this is kind of interesting. The Dreamcast is really the only console that, on the hardware itself, does not have an operating system.
Yeah.
I mean, it does have that startup GUI, but the interesting thing is the GD-ROMs actually had the OS that the game would use.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, there were games that used Windows CE. Well, Windows CE was on the disk, and the developer would utilize the APIs they needed, and that's all that would be included. It was just kind of really interesting, and it used DirectX. If I'm not mistaken, it was DirectX 5.
Yep. If you use Windows CE and everything, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a few games that I have that run Windows CE, and you can tell the differences between DirectX and then Sega's, own APIs.
Yeah, they it's actually been a notorious issue of sorts because while Windows CE helped developers make games quickly for the Dreamcast, the performance was often lacking in one way or another. One example of this is Sega Rally 2 on the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
It's mostly arcade perfect, if not better, but the frame rate suffers. And it's weird because it's not a stable 60 frames per second, but it's really weird because in Japan they had it so you could... I'm trying to think... They had 2 different options for America versus Japan. I believe in Japan, you could, right in the options menu, lock it to 60 frames, but it would still stutter. But it would go up to 60 frames. Now, when they released it in North America, they capped it at 30 by default. There's a special method. It might actually be in the options too. I'd have to boot it up and look. But there was a way to unlock the 60 frames per second, but it was choppy. Like it would jump between 60 and 30. And I suspect they capped it at 30 for that very reason, so that it wouldn't jump around all the time.
Yeah, I don't have any issues with that. I mean, obviously 60 is more preferred today, but back then, at least as far as console gamers go, we didn't really experience too many 60 frames a second games. And if we did, you probably just didn't really notice. You're too busy playing the game.
Right.
And back then we didn't overanalyze.
No.
I do remember this. Tokyo Extreme Racer, that ran at 60 frames per second. It was really solid.
Yeah.
And back then when that came out, it was incredible. And actually a mutual friend of ours, I took it to his house, and back then, we were playing it, and his dad came in the room and thought, I don't know, what is this? You guys watching TV? And it's like, no,
Huh.
this is a video game.
Yeah.
So, the Dreamcast also, granted, I don't, it set so many standards today.
Hmm.
It's so far ahead of its time, and actually, like in more ways than one. Like for instance, the VMU. Now, granted, yes, it's a memory card, and back then all the systems used memory cards.
Hmm.
But with the little screen, you were able to, like, let's say, pick football plays, or it could be a little mini map or something
You
for a
could check your
first-person
health in
shooter.
Resident Evil.
Yeah, various things.
Yeah.
Well, the Wii U essentially is like an extreme advanced version of that,
Hmm.
and there's other things today that we take for granted, like online play. Now, yes, PCs even back then had it, but the Dreamcast made it like all the units that were sold. Here you go, you can use it, and you're all going to have the same system.
Yeah. Prior to that, like, I know the Super Nintendo and Genesis had a thing called X Band, which let
Yeah,
you get online with games. It kind of the games weren't natively made to go online, but it made them work. And
it
then
kind of tricked you into thinking that there was a player two or something like that.
yeah, and I mean, I guess it did work. I never got to try it, but
Me either.
then Sega made the first big plunge, I think, because they
We had the
launched
Sega
the
channel too.
well, they had the Sega channel, but they launched the NetLink for the Sega Saturn, which actually had real online play. Um, I know it worked with like Sega Rally and stuff like that, which is at the time was pretty cool, but not a lot of people really understood it because internet was still pretty new for most people. So it didn't catch on. Plus, it was an add-on for a failing
Yeah.
system,
Yep.
so it was kind of doomed. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot more Sega stuff we could talk about, but we'll save some stories for another podcast because
Yeah,
there's
definitely.
always something with Sega.